I'm James Hughes, bioethicist and resident techno-progressive.
And I'm Nir Isakovich, philosopher and resident Luddite.
And you're listening to Prosthetic Gods, an optimist and a grump on tech, a podcast where we explore the social, ethical, and political impacts of emerging technologies. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. Good to see you.
I went first because listening back to previous episodes, I always sound a little dumb trying to figure out something cute to say to your opening.
Well,
welcome.
You've superseded that today, so
I just preempted it by saying hello first.
Congratulations, two awkward introverts deciding who's going to go first. It's like the prisoner's dilemma of podcast openings.
Exactly. Well, I have been locked in my house for 6 years, so what are you going to do?
There you go.
Today we're talking about right to try, which is a topic close to my heart. Whenever I taught health policy, it was always fun to try to blow their minds about this, why we take for granted that you need to have a prescription for certain things, why can't everything be over the counter, and those kinds of questions. So it's much more timely now because of RFK's interventions at the FDA to deregulate the importation of Chinese peptides, of which there are now dozens and dozens that people are importing to take without any clinical evidence. So we want to talk about the whole field of right to try.
That's right. That's right. Now, am I right that the field sort of takes off under in the context of more extreme circumstances, namely the right of terminal patients to try experimental drugs? Is that kind of the impetus of the question, and then it balloons out to, more sort of benign stuff like Chinese peptides, or does it historically work the other way around?
Well, it's interesting to look back at the history of this because the FDA gets started in the 1920s, an early version of it, and then formally in the 30s. And in 1938 is when we adopted the FDA restrictions on people selling pharmaceuticals in the United States. They had to be subject to clinical approval, to a system of approval. And that system, it has phase 1, 2, and 3 trials, and then you have post-approval surveillance, and I'll have more to say about how I think that should be changed. But once you go through that, then you can sell your drug for approved purposes, and doctors can prescribe them. And in some circumstances, then they also become over the counter. But what happened historically was that it was pretty much that way until AIDS. And then ACT UP really agitated against the government. There had been previous concerns.
Will you just say what ACT UP is?
Okay, so ACT UP is the an AIDS coalition, a grassroots AIDS support organization that started in the late 1980s.
Okay.
And there had been previous confrontations with the FDA where people thought that, this, thing that they're selling abroad, I really need it for my cancer therapy or whatever, and please let me take it. And so they would fight with the FDA about that. But ACT UP really became powerful enough in the early 90s to get the, I think it was the Clinton administration that finally opened up, or maybe it was the H.W. Bush, who said that you could import drugs from abroad. And the reason I'm very familiar with this is because that was when I was first getting involved in transhumanist stuff. Mm-hmm. And I started importing cognitive enhancement drugs that were not approved in the United States from Russia and other places in this 1992.
That's how you end up in the DSA.
Right. Yeah. Well, because I became so smart, I became a social democrat.
There you go.
They had no effect. But I remember the anxiety of, will this actually
You're the only person who took a Russian drug and didn't die from it.
Well, there was, at the time, I have not followed it since.
Transhumanist from Novichok.
There was a certain mystique about Soviet experimentation that they, had been trying to do all these things and were keeping it under wraps. And so this was approved in a Romanian clinic, but only the czars had access to it or whatever. So
sounds like a parody of a James Bond movie.
Look, I have been in that camp of wanting to take these unapproved things from abroad. I understand the impulse. But then you get, so that's left-wing, bottom-up grassroots activism. And now you get the activism of the guys like Hegseth, who thinks that every man in the military should be boosting on testosterone. You get those kind of guys, plus the fact that they hate the federal government and want to take Chinese. For some reason, they trust China. So it used to be Russia, right? Now they trust China to be brewing up in compound pharmacies these peptides that they all want to start taking.
I was just going to say, somebody in a pharmacy somewhere in China is laughing their asses off.
Right. Well, I'm sure every time they make a Keep America Great flag to sell back to us, they're laughing as well.
Yeah.
But the AIDS drugs was the beginning of that deregulation. RFK is trying to expand it. But in between, what happened was, as you're referring to, the compassionate use. There had been compassionate use exemptions. You could appeal, say, look, I have terminal cancer. I think this thing might help me. Could I please try it? And usually the FDA, before 2017, would quickly expedite such claims and usually approve them.
Mm-hmm.
But it was on a one-by-one basis, and you had to go through your hospital's IRB. You had to, and they had to have already been through phase 1 of the clinical testing. And phase 1 basically determines how much will kill you, right? It's not, phase 1 is not to determine whether it works or what the effective doses are. It's just, is it poisonous? And so it had to go through phase 1 in order to be compassionate use. Now, what happened in 2017 was that they adopted the right to try law, and that says you can go through steps now to get access to unapproved drugs. It says to qualify, a patient must meet specific requirements to be diagnosed with a life-threatening condition or disease, have exhausted all conventional approved options, be unable to participate in a clinical trial involving the requested investigational drug, and provide written informed consent to their treating physician. So there are some still requirements, but you don't have to go through an IRB in order to get access to it.
And the drug doesn't have to have passed the step 1 of the clinical approvals.
No.
Okay.
I don't think so. Yeah.
Yeah. I wonder, as an empirical question that I don't know the answer to, in practical terms, whether how much this has expanded access to experimental drugs, because it seems like the policy was pretty lenient before.
Yeah, that's the caution. It was the caution before, and it's the caution now that your right to take it, which is now expanded, does not mean their obligation to sell it. And if it's an investigational compound, it could be quite expensive to produce in these small batches, and they could charge you an arm and a leg. And so we actually have what's called the Orphan Drug Act, which allows companies that are making things for just like 10 people with this condition, but we have a drug. It allows them to hold on to the patents longer and charge whatever they want for it. But at any rate, these companies don't have to make it and make it available to you. And there may be liability reasons for them not to want to.
So I guess this brings us to the first sort of normative question that I really wanted to ask you about as a bioethicist. And you obviously know a lot more about this than I do. But so since a lot of these drugs are actually made by smaller companies or startups, there does seem to be a problem or a tension there, in addition to the obvious reason why you would totally understand a person in desperate, dire straits wanting to try anything that they can try, which is, from my perspective as an individual, I would want to try something outside a clinical trials setting because I want to make sure that I get the actual drug and not placebo, right? And on the other hand...
And it's hard to get into clinical trials.
Right. And it's hard to get into clinical trials in the first place. The risk is if you give somebody even a promising drug out of the setting of clinical trials and something goes wrong, that drug probably will then either not go into clinical trials or get kicked out of clinical trials. And then
it only takes one big famous case to ruin your brand.
And then, this is not, I mean, even to a Johnson & Johnson or an AbbVie, this kind of thing could, wreak havoc. But if we're talking about a startup developing this drug, if something like that happens, their ability to develop the drug goes to hell. And so then the question becomes who and how to balance between the understandable motivation of the individual to get it and these larger societal concerns of protecting the process of developing the drug.
Right. I think this is in bioethics, we always talk about the Beauchamp principles approach, which was very popular for decades, which basically says that there are 3 or 4 basic principles in bioethics: autonomy, beneficence, and justice. And some people would add non-maleficence, because do no harm is one of these medical nostrums. But do no harm is basically part of beneficence. Be nice to people, respect their autonomy, and treat people equally. And of course, the classic conundrums in bioethics are usually the conflicts between paternalism and autonomy. So, the patient comes into the ER and they're burned over 90% of their body, and they say, "Kill me." And you say, "No, I'm not going to kill you because you're not in your right mind, so you can't make a truly autonomous decision. I'm going to paternalistically keep you alive until you decide to agree to stay alive," basically. This is another one of those cases because our intuition, at least in liberal societies, is that we have rights, and I repeat this nostrum all the time, that this is what the transhumanist proposition and the techno-progressive propositions are, is that we have a right to control our bodies, our brains, and our reproduction. And then the state has obligations. We collectively have obligations to each other through the state to ensure that people don't harm themselves. And we have given each other the right to interfere through the state in our individual autonomy to keep us from harming ourselves. And that finding the balance between those two. And the balance in medical ethics has been set at informed consent, that you have the right to do whatever you want with your body, but you also have a right, and we have a social obligation to guarantee your right to informed consent. And part of guaranteeing informed consent means that you need to know through a trustworthy clinical trial process whether this thing actually works and what its side effects are. And if you don't know that, then it's not, you may still have the right to take it, but no one should be allowed to sell it to you, and we can put them in prison if they do.
Yeah. And mainly, I mean, this is one of those cases where the inherent tension between the interest of the individual and the interest of the state is clear, because the policymaker, as it were, has a very powerful interest in many of these cases to protect the integrity of if there is integrity, to protect the integrity of the clinical trials process so that the drug can potentially reach as many people as possible. So I think a lot of the concerns end up being that rich people, like in many other contexts, are going to benefit much more from access to experimental drugs one way or another than others. Has that been your experience and your understanding of the literature?
I don't think that there's been as much attention to wealth inequity and access to clinical trials, because like half of clinical trials are cancer drugs or cancer therapies.
Well, no, and getting stuff outside of clinical trials, I mean.
Oh, definitely. Anything that, if you had a completely unregulated market in drugs, then yes, we would not know what we were taking, and then the rich would have access to things before the rest of us. Now, but if they're taking things that don't work and are a waste of their money and kill them, do we care, right? And so that's been the thing. It's like a caveat emptor, buyer beware environment is one that could potentially benefit the rich, but it could also be that they, screw themselves up. I mean, one of the things that we saw was medical tourism over the last couple decades. People were flying to offshore clinics and to places in China until China banned it, where you could get stem cells injected into your body, and they were probably worthless. But some medical treatments may in fact be carcinogenic, like telomerase. Dosing yourself up with telomerase, theoretically, it was an anti-aging treatment, but it could also be an accelerant of cancer. So, just the fact that it's offshore doesn't mean that it actually works. And that's the whole point here.
But let's take the slightly more complicated scenario, which is I'm sure that at least a small minority of these treatments or a small minority of people do something good. For you as a transhumanist, as long as there's informed consent and you can pay for it yourself, there's no reason for the state to intervene.
Yes. I think a lot of people share the intuition that you should be able to control your own body. I mean, if you're allowed to take alcohol, right? The side effects of alcohol are well known, well documented. We have a right to take alcohol. But of course, part of this history is also the regulation of alcohol, because people used to drink moonshine. So now you can only buy alcohol. You can't make your own alcohol and sell it without being approved. For exactly the same reasons, because people used to make moonshine that would kill people or make them go blind or whatever. And we intervened federally to stop that and say, no, it has to be an approved alcohol seller. It's the same logic.
Yeah, I guess not. I get the logic. I guess my sense is that in real life, both hope and desperation, which under these extreme circumstances actually come pretty close together, interfere with quality of informed consent, interfere with your patients to collect information, interfere with what it meaningfully means to consent to something.
That is also a long debate in bioethics about whether certain and this is part of IRB protections as well. Certain populations have compromised autonomy and so cannot, in fact, be asked to give informed consent. So under certain circumstances, prisoners, you go to a prisoner and suggest something that under some circumstances, they will not actually feel like they can consent because there's so overwhelming pressures on them. And similarly, the demented can't consent. Somebody else has to consent on their behalf at any rate. And then people who are terminally ill are often in the condition where they're willing to spend $100,000 on, apricot seeds from abroad. And you say, no, that's really bad for you and your family and the rest of society if we allow that.
Yeah. And I mean, the rest of society kind of argument, I mean, again, to play devil's advocate or to state a position that I'm not completely sure I agree with, but if you do spend $100,000 as you're dying on apricot seeds, where then it becomes clear that the state needs to pick up the slack after you pass away to potentially support your family with social services, they're in this hypothetical state. The argument does begin to emerge about why it shouldn't be allowed to spend $100,000 on apricot seeds, at least before you can establish that you have something to take care of the people who survive you.
Well, yeah, the snake oil phrase comes from the 19th century when people would just put all kinds of crap in bottles and sell it to you. I mean, like something like 25% of American women in rural areas in the 1890s were addicted to laudanum, which was a mixture of alcohol and opium. And it was just being sold over the counter as, it fixes what ails you.
Yeah.
Cocaine was legal.
Yeah.
So there are reasons that we created these federal structures.
Can you, to sort of be more concrete about this, could you give one or two sort of very concrete contemporary use cases of how still staying with the dire straits extreme dying patient example of how somebody would benefit from one of these right to try scenarios?
Well, I don't know if any of the peptides, for instance, are contemporary examples of something that people would take for cancer treatment or for a terminal illness. Most of them seem to be health boosters, boosting healing and endurance and those kinds of things. So more transhumanist category of benefits.
Right. So let's wait with that a second. But it would basically be something like a cancer drug approved somewhere else, but considered to be very, very risky here, or even something being tested experimentally in a different country that the experiments haven't yet been evaluated here. and you would argue for your right to try it in a local hospital if you could pay for its administration, something like that?
Right. By the way, the harmonization of international pharmaceutical standards has been a topic of negotiation for decades, and it is taking way too long. But basically, nobody trusts other places how they do it, and we have effectively the gold standard. The U.S. FDA until now
used to be, yeah.
Used to be. European drug agencies have a collective standard for approving drugs. They have different standards. Like here, once a drug's approved, you can use it off-label. So the doctor can say, "Look, this is an approved drug. But I'm going to prescribe it for this condition that it would not otherwise be used for, as an investigation." That's legal here. It's not legal in Europe. If doctors have to prescribe according to the intended purpose of the drug.
Yeah, which is a separate interesting discussion, because if off-label use is based on rigorous data, which increasingly here, I think there's a couple of research centers that focus on that, and AI is accelerating that kind of discussion. That's a really interesting set of examples for the right to try, which would support it. Namely, if there is data about off-label use and it just hasn't sort of entered the mainstream conversation because commercial incentives aren't there, that would speak for expanding your right to try.
Yeah, that would be right to try after it's already been approved for something. And then you could try it for other things. And I think that makes sense too, because going through the clinical trial process does determine, as I said, the toxicity level.
Right.
It doesn't tell you whether it really works for the thing that you're going to try it for next.
Yeah. So would you agree with the set of moral intuitions that said that in extreme cases, in cases of terminally ill patients, on the one hand, the defense of the right to try is particularly robust because there's so little left to lose on the one hand. And on the other hand, the sort of remaining kind of moral question is the one that we talked about earlier, namely the one having to do with the tension between the individual willing to try anything and what the trying of anything does to the integrity of the drug development process, which might benefit other people. So that if you get to try a cancer drug too quickly and something goes wrong, then other people don't get it, and there's a moral consideration there. That seems to me to be the kind of those seem to me to be the boundaries of the conversation. Am I missing something?
No, and I'm going to relate it to a clinical trial term called equipoise, which is basically that in bioethics, it's considered an obligation that you only do a clinical trial. You only give people a placebo arm of an investigational compound if you're truly uncertain about whether the investigational drug doesn't work. If there's real uncertainty, and then the question is, what does real uncertainty mean? Why would you be testing it in the first place if there's real uncertainty? But there has to be some uncertainty, and that's called equipoise. As soon as you get in a clinical trial to the point where it's clear that it's working, then it becomes ethically dubious to be denying it to people in the other arm of the trial, even though you may then short circuit the collection of the information of its efficacy. But the reason I bring that up is because I'm in equipoise about the balance between individual liberty and state obligation in this case, because the history of medical quackery and its harms on society and the sketchy moral character of the people who usually engage in it make us want to punish them and keep that from happening. But at the same time, I'm a huge supporter of the right to individual autonomy. And we also are in a situation where using tech, people may be able to make things themselves. And that's the kind of DIY or do-it-yourself biohacking that's going on. People getting lab gene equipment and brewing up their own genetic therapies and injecting themselves with them. That's been going on for a decade already, since CRISPR was invented.
So just to sort of get clear on what you said, What is the state of the art on equipoise questions in drug development? So, beyond the moral principle, if it does become increasingly clear that a drug is working or has very high potential to work, are drug companies allowed to continue clinical trials just to keep collecting data as a legal matter?
Well, the fallback has been, okay, this researcher is probably never in equipoise because the researcher wants to research this compound because they think it's going to work. So that can't ever be the standard because those people are never in equipoise. But is really a question about whether society is in equipoise? If society is uncertain until this trial is done, then even if the evidence is accumulating during the trial that it's saving lives, you still have to complete the trial because society is still.
What does that mean, though, for society not to be certain?
Well, it becomes tautological. Society is uncertain because you haven't completed the trial yet. You have to complete the trial for society to become certain.
I see. So there comes a moment in the life cycle of many of these trials that completing them becomes a moral challenge.
Yeah, I think that that's absolutely true. I'll just say one more thing in this context, that I have also argued for a long time for what's called observational trials. And this basically means one way to get around this right to try issue within the clinical trial regime. So we already said that once it's approved, it can be used for other purposes. That's one way to get around it. But before it's been approved in a phase 3 trial, the phase 3 trial is usually the biggest trial before you actually allow people to start taking it in society, that tries to figure out what the best way to take it is, what the timing, the pace, the dosage, and so forth, for it to be effective and how effective it is. Whether it really, when you present the data to the FDA, are you going to be able to say it stops X amount of cancer or whatever, gives people this number of years of life. One of the ways to get around our current restrictions is to say, when you get to a phase 3 level, we're going to allow anyone with X number of conditions to enter this trial with a quid pro quo, which is that they all have to wear a Fitbit and pee into a machine in their home and be intensely monitored. But they don't have to fit all the criteria that a randomized clinical trial usually says. You can't have other conditions, you can't be taking other drugs. So that you get this very narrow set of populations that are allowed to be in randomized clinical trials. If you broaden that out and said, let everybody who wants to take this drug at this point take it under the quid pro quo that they tell us exactly what's going on day to day. And then we figure out statistically whether it works or not. So that's called the observational trial program. And I think that would relieve a lot of this pressure because a lot of people who are terminally ill would be able to enter those trials then.
Yeah. So let me expand on this and connect it to something that you said earlier. And this takes our right to try discussion beyond the terminally ill. So let's think about the scenario of the tinkerer. And let's combine, the advent of CRISPR, so the potential advent and popularization of CRISPR combined with AI, combined with home labs, combined with smart devices like watches and rings, etc. And then all of a sudden, all of which is here and increasingly the horizon, all of which combines to a scenario where something like that rich dude who is trying to live forever, I'm forgetting his name, was it Brian Johnson?
Brian Johnson.
Yeah, the guy who was trying to...
Do not crap on Brian Johnson. I'm quite sympathetic with him.
I'm not. I mean, he just discovered that he has an autoimmune condition.
Which had nothing to do with the things that he was doing.
Which had nothing to do, right. But so bracket his autoimmune condition and we wish him the best. But I guess my question is, the combination of all of these factors that I've enumerated, from CRISPR to Fitbits to cheaper home labs, suggests that you could, the barrier to entry to be Brian Johnson has just become a lot lower. Again, for our listeners, Brian Johnson is a multimillionaire who has dedicated all of his material and psychological resources to radical life extension and the grand tradition that Jay is so enamored with. And my question,
completely in the public eye, telling people exactly what he's doing
in the
and what
public
the
eye,
consequences
because there's
were.
nothing more interesting than rather than hanging out with your family doing that.
Well, would you rather watch Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous or Famous People's Cribs or How to Keep Alive for a Long Time?
I'd rather read Tolstoy, as you know, but that is not my question. My question is, one thing if it's a curiosity of Brian Johnson doing that. My sense is that here, in a very different way from terminal patients, it does become a question of social concern for social democratically oriented legislators / policymakers to make sure that not everybody becomes a Brian Johnson. As I was last night trying to think about what you would say about this, I heard one version of Jay agreeing with me and the other disagreeing. So which version of Jay do you want to be this morning?
Well, I just told you I'm in equipoise. This is one where I really get hung up, and I think it's pretty much a case-by-case basis. I think there are certain compounds, and this is also relates to how we regulate genetically modified organisms. It's like, is it something that's completely novel and that we have a reason to think might, in fact, have consequences that we've never seen before? Or is it just you tweaked corn and made it a little bit less fibrous or whatever? If that's all you did, then it probably isn't going to harm you that much. And so we can just expedite the approval of this particular GMO into the population. But if you're hybridizing apples and corn, then we don't know what the hell's going on. So we need to test that. I think the same thing could be done with drugs. It's like there are some things that have high risk potentials and other things that don't. The argument that they seem to be making about peptides was that it has low risk potential, which I'm not sure why they come to that conclusion, because GLP-1s are a peptide, and one of the reasons why we started importing peptides was people wanted cheaper access to GLP-1s, but then it turned out that there were dozens of others behind that. But if you start dosing yourself up with gene therapies, I think the potential is enormous for harm. So I think you can make a distinction on the basis of that.
My worry
again,
is, yeah.
I'm still in equipoise about whether you have the right to do that to yourself. And whether the only people should be punished are the ones who sold it to you and told you that you could help you.
I mean, my anxiety is that while you're in equipoise, and I, actually like the stance of equipoise. I think that's a good Burkean stance, and in fact, he uses the very word in the conclusion of the Reflections on the Revolution in France to describe his own position. So this is, to me, secret evidence that I'm winning you over. But the worry here is that while we're in equipoise, both of us reposing in equipoise, the pace of access to instruments of tinkering is such that people are going to do harm to themselves. And so we have this combination of high access to very sophisticated measures of tinkering where we can play with, dosages and the genetic makeup of some of these compounds, while we also are in the process of kind of dismissing additional sources of authority. So there seems to be a kind of worrying generational gap here between people like you and me who are happy to be in different versions of equipoise and sort of taking this on a case-by-case basis, and the acceleration of self-experimentation and the tools for self-experimentation. Am I being alarmist, or do you think that there's something to that?
It seems like for historical memory purposes, every generation needs its own thalidomide. And if we don't remember thalidomide, actually, thalidomide is a different story than the way that people mostly remember, because it was most of the thalidomide victims, it was a drug that was being given to women, not yet in the United States because the FDA hadn't approved it, but abroad, it was being given to women for extreme nausea during pregnancy, and it caused extreme birth defects and death. It became a landmark example in the early 60s of why we need FDA approval of drugs. But I think every generation, just like this generation doesn't remember the Soviet Union, and therefore says all kinds of dumb things about communism sometimes, they don't remember how bad an unregulated drug market can be.
Well, I am, with great equipoise and poise, going to ignore your silly comment about the Soviet Union and focus on something else.
My son. Well, I thought you would. Oh, you're a fan of the Soviet Union. I was just saying people.
I thought you were going in the other direction. Okay.
No. Okay, I'm saying the reason why social democracy has weak tea compared to Marxist-Leninism these days is because a lot of young people just don't remember the Cold War and what the Soviet Union was.
Good boy.
Yeah.
Okay, you're doing well. You're doing well. And I need to up the attention a little bit.
There you go. Your working space, your workspace theory is weak here. Anyway, I think that the current moment is still a very complicated one. As much as I would love to be crapping on RFK and the reasons, the Joe Roganish reasons.
Well, let's get to RFK because I am curious about how he fits into this. But actually, before RFK, on the one hand, this sounds a little bit like a version of some of our previous debates where you say what's happening now is just a contemporary variation on the thalidomide crisis. And then I guess I push back, which is it?
Well, there were no American women clamoring to want to take thalidomide.
Well, right.
If there had been.
And their ability to influence the makeup of thalidomide was non-existent. And I think that that's the kind of thing that we're talking about now. So the worry is when you give consumers, most of whom, are more concerned about how many wrinkles they have than about, what they can see, control over the genetic makeup of what they are consuming, aren't you in a completely different world, which you should be much more worried about? So it's the fact that the people who are the tinkerers are not tinkerers like Benjamin Franklin used to be, but rather they have AI. Pretty soon they'll have versions of and home labs and, versions of 3D printing that can probably print drugs for them. Under those kind of circumstances, it seems like the tinkering impulse, which you like, understandably, as a transhumanist, becomes more deadly.
Yeah. Caveat emptor means that some people will die. And the question here is, in the balance between individual liberty and state obligation, how many people dying is acceptable?
Yeah. You just need to slowly start dismissing individual liberty. I've been telling you that. Just come up with a benevolent
I'm from the state, and we will make you safe. I think we already tried that under COVID, and people didn't like it very much, and that's what got us in this mess in the first place.
Well, that's because the people running the state were not much to write home about. But yeah.
Well, there's that problem too. Yes, that is the recent history, is that there has been a growing populist backlash on the part of people who wanted X. And who, this health nuts have been around for a long time. Mm-hmm. I grew up with a mother who fed us almonds every day because she had read that it stopped cancer, and she took a handful of vitamins every day. And I take a handful of vitamins every day. So I'm still in that health nut environment. So this has been around for a long time. And people in that alternative health environment have often been at odds with the FDA. Mm-hmm. But COVID really super boosted that because there was so much backlash against inconsistent COVID prevention information and PPEs and everything that went down. And then conspiracy theories about the vaccines. That combined with a left critique of the pharmaceutical industry's motivations in how they develop what they're developing, how they develop it, and how they get it approved. That is partly correct, right? Mm-hmm. It is true that pharmaceutical companies, like with SSRIs, a lot of the negative clinical evidence from clinical trials that SSRIs actually help with depression was suppressed by the pharmaceutical companies during the clinical trial era, and it only, in retrospect, became clear that maybe SSRIs are effective, but only for people with really, really severe depression, and not as effective as we thought. So they are partly correct. What this populist backlash that the whole system.
I'll add
stinks.
One more factor, by the way, which is the scientific establishment's complete failure in PR departments. The complete sort of almost Obama-esque willingness to think that good science explains itself, which it doesn't. So you have this kind of, the scientists during COVID sort of giving up the field to claims of dogmatism against them, which they were just doing sort of regular science, but they allowed themselves to be portrayed as dogmatic, which they weren't really more dogmatic than any of the usual scientific process. So I think the sort of dismissal of rhetoric from science also plays a part of this.
Fauci's changes of position were depicted as somehow contrary to science,
right?
When in fact it was following, it was Bayesian science. Yeah. Today it looks like this, tomorrow it looks like this. And I think that is a more general problem between liberal and conservative ways of cognition, because liberals are more committed to epistemic virtue and to the ambiguities and to uncertainties.
And they consistently reject, this is an interesting question in political theory, but they consistently reject the value of propaganda, where propaganda is primarily bad if it propagandizes bad things and is good. Even Martin Luther King spoke of the propaganda of peace. Like, all good causes need propaganda and all bad causes need propaganda, and you need to be able to distinguish between good and bad causes rather than argue against propaganda as being inherently bad.
And that's hugely important in public health, is like the reason that people stopped smoking had only a little bit to do with direct anti-smoking campaigns, but it was because of the general propaganda that smoking was a dumb thing for people to do, convince society.
But let's go back to RFK and the MAHA movement and the relationship between...
So they grew out of COVID backlash, basically, or they had pre-existed it, but then they hugely got boosted by it.
The right to try sort of pushes to that moment in the zeitgeist.
Right, exactly.
But I'm actually asking.
Connect the actual... Yeah. Well, it was enacted first under Trump 1 in 2017.
Right.
And so it kind of reflected a deregulatory move at the time.
Yeah.
And some other things were happening. There was the 21st Century Cures Act, which I think it was 2018 or when it was adopted. But that act also expanded some of the expedited pathways to getting things approved. It expanded how you get things approved, like the use of biomarkers in various situations. Instead of having to prove that people actually live longer, which would take 30 or 40 years, you can use biomarkers for some things. So I think there are other reforms that the deregulators have proposed, which I'm more or less positive about.
Yeah.
But the degree to which this is this really reflects the notion on the libertarian right that they have said for 100 years that if you have this kind of clinical trial regulatory regime, FDA regime, you're killing people, you're not saving lives. That, in their calculus, the number of people who could have lived if you had not even just approved other things that you didn't approve, but just approve things quicker, that it took an extra couple of years to get things approved, and all the people who died during that time could have been saved. So that's their argument.
Right. I guess I'm seeing a tension in the grounds for arguing the RFK MAHA kind of argument. One is a libertarian / right transhumanist kind of argument, which you just sort of laid out. By slowing down the process, you are killing people.
Sometimes called the proactionary principle,
right,
as opposed to the precautionary.
Right. And the other, which I think is a little bit different. Again, I'm a little bit out of my depth here, so correct me if I'm incorrect. The other is a more populist, anti-elitist, anti-scientific establishment kind of argument, which is, who the fuck are you with your PhDs, MDs to sort of tell me, not to drink magic water, et cetera, et cetera. Like, why is if I think that, this slower schedule of taking A, B, or C is much better, who are you with your stupid experiments to tell me otherwise in your round glasses? And I'm hearing both of these kind of grounds, or is that not the case?
I'll be even more precise about it. I think that there's three positions on science on that side. One is, I don't care if you proved it up and down the wazoo, because I know that only homeopathy works, that's one of the kinds of alternative health positions out there, where they don't really, they've completely rejected the legitimacy of science.
Mm-hmm.
But, and then at the other extreme, there's the transhumanist, right-wing libertarian, techno-billionaire, whatever, who theoretically is committed to science, but they have a broader notion of what science is, and this one little study from, Croatia is science as well, and so I'm going to take it. But eventually you could convince them, this doesn't actually work, this is going to kill you, so don't take it. But in between, there are people who say, I'm committed to science, but the entire apparatus of science is poisoned by capitalist profit and scientists' self-interest. And therefore, only this study from Croatia is trustworthy. And so there's really quite a divergence here, from the religious, spiritual healing nuts to the alternative science crowd.
Yeah, I mean, in that context, sometimes only that study from Croatia is what's available. So if I get a rare disease, or if I get a disease that has bad PR, is not sexy enough to merit attention, under the sort of marriage between science and capitalism that you outline, there's not going to be too many options for me except for the study from Croatia to pursue. And therefore, my pursuit of it, even if committed to the scientific process, seems to be understandable. I guess, and this is an empirical question, it does seem to be that the marriage between capitalism and drug development has resulted in more drug development more impressively in this country than in Western Europe, hasn't it? So in other words, the financial, as a matter of, as you know me, I'm a small c conservative. I want everybody to, grow their own cucumbers. But it does seem like that nexus, by and large, has worked, hasn't it?
Worked for innovation.
Innovation, yeah. Like, you pay people a shitload of money, they innovate more than if you have them employed by the state.
Well, if the question is, does private enterprise innovate more than state enterprise, I'm on record as being a weak toast social democrat and agreeing that one advantage.
Right, you already got kicked out of the DSA. So they were on the fence, and then they're like, he's talking to that asshole? Out with him.
Well, the evidence so far is that capitalism has been more innovative than state ownership, and I think that that's true in biotech as well. On the other hand, the U.S. was the global pioneer in clinical testing regimes, and the FDA was a gold standard until now for what kinds of scientific acumen should be brought to bear on these decisions.
It was a gold standard, like per your argument, it was a gold standard mainly for ourselves because we were developing most of the drugs because we were more capitalist than everybody else.
Right, but then we were also selling a lot of those drugs abroad and influencing a lot of their regulatory
being able
regimes.
To say that we have the gold standard for making sure that they're safe.
And you, when you look at the relationship with innovation, and you say, this cuts both ways as well. Whenever the attacks on the FDA have occurred, big tech, biotech, is not opposed to the FDA. The biotech does not want to see the FDA eliminated. They want to see it tweaked a little bit. They want to see it expedited. They want to have influence over its decisions. But they see it as a critical part of the innovative engine because it provides the information that people need in order to take the thing, and it's a liability sink.
So entertain this as a great exercise in empathy and imagination on my part, trying to enter your strange world. And isn't there a cynical kind of inflection in the capitalist saying something like free market societies develop the most amount of drugs? That means that only primarily, mainly sexy, widespread diseases, perhaps those afflicting some parts of the socioeconomic rainbow than others, are going to be addressed first. And for the rest of you, we believe in individual liberty, so you'll have an expanded right to try, and you're free to experiment with compounds from Croatia to your heart's content. We would never get in your way. That seems to be very convenient for the capitalist.
It is one of the, and this again is a social democratic argument, is that yes, even if capitalism is more innovative in biotech, the way to deal with that is for the state to give sufficient incentives to direct their attention to the places where it needs to be directed. Because given their want as capitalist firms, they will otherwise make boner pills and not look for cures for malaria, which is killing, billions of people. They will not come up with a male contraceptive, et cetera, et cetera. They will come up with boner pills. So
right.
I think, and so the state, and this is, like for biosecurity, what motivations does a firm have to come up with a vaccine for anthrax right now? None. So you have to...
Basically, it's like cure malaria, because when you do, you will be able to sell so much more Viagra, right?
Yes, right. The 2-in-1. Yeah, you get your GLP-1, your boner pill, and your malaria treatment all at once.
There you go. So we can't complete this discussion without talking about the brave new world of Chinese peptides. So what's up with that for our listeners who have been too busy watching Love Island, and how does it fit into our matrix today?
Well, peptides are short-chain amino acids, and GLP-1 drugs, weight loss drugs, are all peptides. And when they started to take off a couple years ago, there was a decision to allow compounding pharmacies in the United States to make them. So this is one of the issues: is who gets to make a drug.
What's an example of a peptide that gets used already that people would be familiar with?
Semaglutide is the one that's in Ozempic, and then tirzepatide is the one that I take in Mounjaro, and it's in Wegovy.
And what kind of experimental peptides are people like trying to import for China, and for what?
So there's things like BPC-157 for tissue repair, CJC-1295 for growth hormone release, and dihexa for cognition. So there's one called Moxie that's for resilience, which is a Yiddish.
That's funny. So for the gym rats and for the people studying for the ACT, there's all kind of new.
And this of course has been very appealing for the Silicon Valley. They have disposable incomes, and they want to grind 60 hours a week at their desk, and so they dose themselves up. I've actually seen pictures from China. Who knows how doctored they were, but of a bunch of kids studying for an exam in a room with IV bags dripping into their arms so that they can take their peptides.
And do we know how widespread the phenomena of importing these enhancement-related peptides is, and B, what kind of regulation efforts, if any, are underway?
I haven't seen any good importation statistics. It's not as regulated as everything else, so it's hard for people to keep track of, I guess. But it apparently has gone up, and we'll put in the show notes links to articles, mostly anecdotal, about people taking them in California and the potential downsides. Some people have had some negative experiences with them already. But the argument that RFK made about these things, at the urging of Joe Rogan and others, is that reviewing the risk profile so far of the various side effects, it's mostly anecdotal and not that serious. And I suspect that is the case with these peptides.
Well, I'm happy that you have Joe Rogan as the as the arbiter of your health. I wish you
my equipoise. I'm losing my equipoise. All of a sudden, you reminded me.
I wish you good luck with that. I think he can use some cognition-enhancing peptides, or he's good evidence that they don't work. Okay,
I think the nature of clinical evidence is interesting here as well. It's like a lot of the clinical evidence that people are referring to for whether these things would be at all useful, it comes from animal models, especially mouse models, and because they haven't gone through human trials yet. And animal models have, if we had cured cancer as often as we've cured rat cancer or mouse cancer, we'd be in really good shape.
Yeah.
But a lot of the stuff that works for mice doesn't work for humans in the same way.
I mean, what's interesting is that, for example, if some of the peptides are being engineered and designed in China, China does not have a cultural tendency for libertarian self-tinkering. It has much more of a top-down ethos of perhaps collective tinkering for the benefit of, the people.
I'd say the way I see China's regulatory regime is they often don't pay attention to things until they do, and when they do, they really do. Like they just banned companionship chatbots, which I sent you the news. I'm sure you're delighted to be on the same side as the Communist Party.
I am delighted.
Yeah.
In fact,
people are no longer allowed to have robot girlfriends and boyfriends in China.
Yep.
And before that, it was Wild West, and it was very popular.
Yeah. Once in a while, communists do the right thing.
That's right. I mean, I think China is very worried about some of the consequences of digital experimentation as well as medical experimentation. The fact that the Dr. Hu was the one who genetically engineered the two baby girls a decade ago, and
spent too much time talking to his chatbot companion, but now he wouldn't be allowed.
That's right. Well, he purportedly did that to prevent them from getting HIV, which was absurd.
Yeah,
but did it in a relatively deregulated genetic experimentation environment.
Until it got the attention that it got.
Until it got the international attention that it got. And then China cracked down quite hard on him and then on the field.
Yeah. It is an interesting kind of, it's very easy to become sort of, paranoid, Cold War-ish about all of this. But there is certainly an interesting kind of cultural, political angle to this of enemies exporting and importing these kind of practices to each other, just like, the CIA tried to weaponize rock and roll in the 70s and the 80s, and, will the Chinese attempt to weaponize peptides at some point if this Cold War intensifies?
Well, I think to be slightly less paranoid. I mean, there definitely are paranoids
I'm not
out
paranoid.
there.
The CIA, like there were magazines like Encounter, etc. There was a sort of soft culture war during the Cold War in the 70s and the 80s.
Sure. And during the 60s, the idea that there might be manipulation of international recreational drugs in order to pacify populations or addict inner city populations or so forth. And the fentanyl crisis has its own conspiracy theory about how this is actually a Chinese conspiracy to import these drugs. So what else might they be doing if we start importing?
No, but that is, as far as we know, conspiracy theory. But during the Cold War, there were these kind of attempts from both sides to wage cultural Cold War, which were well funded and kind of weird stories.
Which you could think about it going all the way back to us facilitating the access to alcohol for Native Americans because we knew it was going to have a bad effect on them, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, I mean, I think to be a little bit less paranoid, there is a legitimate concern about being dependent on other countries for drugs, and we saw that during COVID. That we don't want. I mean, it turned out that the American vaccines, because of Project Lightspeed or whatever it was called, turned out to be the most effective in the world, and the Chinese one was not as effective. The Chinese one, they were giving it away to people around the world, but it just turned out to be half as effective as ours.
Yeah. So I do think as more of a concluding set of remarks, it is interesting that you, as a transhumanist who is, on the other hand, also committed to questions of equipoise, if I'm understanding your argument correctly, you are more permissive and excited about transhumanist self-tinkering with technology like smartwatches and sensors, etc., than necessarily you would be with the administration of drugs as a form of self-tinkering.
Well, let's take transhumanism out of it for a second, because we're not really talking about any... I mean, I think one of the reasons people are attracted to the peptides is because some of them promise certain kinds of performance enhancement, resilience, healing, and so forth that you could say is in an enhancement category. But the vast majority of people who are interested in self-experimentation are either terminally ill or, pro-risk people who think that it might be some benefit to them. They're not committed transhumanists or anything. But I think the reason I'm in equipoise and want to take this case by case is because I think there is a risk-benefit ratio, a Bayesian updating one every day. New evidence comes online about whether there's risks and benefits to these things, and that we have to just play it by ear. And the possibility that people are going to screw themselves up by strapping a Fitbit on, compared to whether they're going to be attempting to genetically engineer themselves, I think it's obvious that, genetically engineering yourself is something. I don't want people selling genetic engineering kits to civilians without clear clinical purpose.
Yeah. And the other side of this same argument, again, which I think it's important to raise in summary, even though we touched on it, is my sense that in the non-emergency cases, in the non-terminal illness cases, the passion and excitement for self-tinkering rises or increases as the level of trust in the scientific establishment decreases. Namely,
that's right.
And I think we are historically in a very low period in the trust of the scientific establishment. And as I said, I don't think they have earned it by their failures. I just think they've earned it specifically by their dismissal of self-promotion, which is taken to be a non-scientific endeavor.
Well, then that's why they should join the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, because one of our missions is to turn people with academic expertise into public intellectuals. And at the Applied Ethics Center at University of Massachusetts, Boston, they could learn all the ethical theory that they need in order to argue their case in public. So
there you go. And then proceed to read Burke to scare the shit out of themselves.
But yes, I think this has been a great conversation. I think these issues aren't going to go away, and society is still in equipoise, as I said, about how much regulation we
You're
need.
in equipoise. I don't think actually society is in equipoise.
I think society
should be.
Is uncertain about how much regulation we need. When we see, like we were talking about Brian Johnson at the beginning, we see people experimenting with themselves. There's a lot of public revulsion, especially when they're rich. I think there's less when they're extremely sick. But so I don't think that this deregulatory mood that has captured the FDA through RFK is going to last much longer. I think we'll go back to trust in science soon.
Yeah. Well, from your lips to God's ears, as they say.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. Talk to you again, my friend.
Talk to you. Good to see you, man.
Prosthetic Gods is hosted by me, Jay Hughes, sociologist, bioethicist, and the executive director of the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, and by Nir Esakovitz, philosopher and director of UMass Boston's Applied Ethics Center. You can find us at prostheticgods.podbean.com. In the words of Sigmund Freud, man has, as it were, become a kind of prosthetic god. When he puts on all his auxiliary organs, he is truly magnificent. But those organs have not grown onto him, and they still give him much trouble at times.